Hello, everyone. Hello. Trying to bring some energy from Petros talk. It's so good to be here for the second time in a row for the Selenium Conf in London, especially on a topic that I love. And this is also kind of inspiring. So how many of you have seen talk or have been to Berlin Selenium Conference? Right, it's not most of you. So I would recommend you looking for a keynote session by my friend Ashley out here, where she spoke about the death of liberal arts, which emphasizes more about the fact of education paying more towards the STEM, the science, technology, engineering, math, but leaving more about the humanity and all the empathy that we can provide to all the users. So that's an inspiration towards me also working on this field. I've been working on usability and accessibility for about close to 3 to 4 years now in a company that I worked, and here to share some of the insights about it. And before we get on, as Ashley mentioned for the last minute, I hope Wim Celeste and his family is doing great. So more strength to you, mate. We miss you. With that, I am Manoj Kumar, of the technical lead at Applitools, and also one of the core committee members for Selenium. I've been contributing for about 9 years now, mostly on the JavaScript bindings a little bit, and Docker Selenium, and a little bit of documentation and revamping the new website. So that was most of my work towards. And also equally enthusiastic about accessibility and usability aspect. So let's start. Design is not just what it looks and feels like. Design is how it works, the famous word said by the man himself, Steve Jobs, who's known for producing designs that matters more usable way. So I think I heard a story, I'm not sure if that's entirely true, but then I was fascinated about the story where when they were trying to build a new iPhone back then, the product team was there to build the iPhone, and then they handed over to Steve Jobs saying, this is the design that he came up with, right? And then he said, no, this is not the best design. And then it went over many iterations, and then finally they came up with something like, no, this is done. Are we sure we have a good CEO of the company who knows what matters on the UX, right? But then when the final version came up, so then Steve Jobs, he thought, okay, now this is where I need to explain my employees what needs to do. So he put up that iPhone into a fish tank that was nearby. And then you can actually see some air bubbles pop out. So then he said that, do you see that air bubbles? Which means that there's a thin space of air inside, which means that there's a few more things that you could trim down to make the world's most slimmest phone and a more usable phone. So there you go. So that's how the design matters, and which is also relatively applicable to not just products itself, but also for all the websites and mobile apps where we mostly work on. And also that comes to the fact that beauty comes second, isn't it? So for example, websites like Craigslist, most of you know here, Reddit, I'm going to talk a little bit about it, and Google, for example. So these websites put user experience in front, having the beauty second. So that's the special part of it, right? And also, tying back to the current industry trend, the era of digital transformation. I was so fortunate to be part of a CIO summit that happened in Australia, where the number of CEOs where they were asked to say, what's your number one priority, right? So some say like cost reduction, new technology stack, AI, machine learning, blah, blah, blah. But then the most common thing was cost reduction, right? And also trying to cope up with the new trends in tech. So this stats out here was conducted by Applitools Visual Testing Survey with more than 400 companies up there, which is very relevant for all of us here, which shows how many releases and averages they do and what the number of screens changes. Well, that's all good. That's fine. A change is refreshing, isn't it? But also, users resist change. How many of you agree to that? Absolutely, right? Especially Facebook, where they make changes just like this, and then it's like, no, where did I find the button there? So that's how it goes. And I have a couple of examples in the next few slides. Dig. How many of you know Dig? Cool. So Reddit. How many of you know Reddit? Cool. For those of you who raised hands for Reddit, but not for Dig, so Dig was actually a version of Reddit before even Reddit existed, right? And what happened to Dig but then? So that's the story. So Dig redesign fiasco, right? So but the purpose was the same, to have everything, news, videos, and images out there. But then, so Dig thought something refreshing, like changes refreshing. So they went ahead with something new version of the website, like Dig 3.0, a massive change. And then another change a couple of months ago, not much time. So they did something called Dig fiasco. Sorry, Dig apocalypse, right? Which led to a massive, massive, massive number of exodus, where users start lamenting them, and absolutely, that's when they lost to Reddit. But then, when the Dig was there, Reddit exists as well. But not many people know about Reddit, so that's the main part about it. When this happened, that's when people starting the exodus and moved towards Reddit. Well, lessons learned. I think they're still catching up with all the UIs that's available right now. And there's eBay. How many of you remember this screen? Back in 80s, 90s? Cool. So the funny part about eBay is they have this yellowish background, which stayed for a long number of time. But then they thought, OK, let's rephrase and refresh the UI screen to be a little bit whiter, because back then Google had whitish number of screens, and people start loving that screen, and they thought, okay, let's move our background to be whiter, right? So all of a sudden they changed the eBay website to be whitish background. Again, the same happened back in days. We don't have any social media, you can't vent out anywhere, but then all the developers and the product owners, they got emails, like literally by the post saying, what the heck you have been doing? It's literally lamenting out there. So, as a CEO of the company, what he did was quite fascinating and quite interesting. So what he did was, okay, so that's the change that is by the users. So let me flip back to what it was, and then this was still there. So interestingly, he wrote an algorithm that will change the color of yellow to be a little bit lighter every day, right? And over a period of time, you have that neat whitish background. So that's how eBay got into a screen which had an yellow theme to it into a white theme. So that's the eBay story. So, and the reason why I'm going through is because, as I said, users like change is refreshing, but then users resist change, and how do you cope up with that? And there's an example of Dig, and there's an example of eBay right now, which boils down to make your users feel smart, isn't it? So many of you can guess which one is a salt and a pepper shaker. Salt's on the right. So what makes you qualify that as a salt? More number of holes? Good, good. So when you're hungry and you have an omelet in front of you, and then you have this which is 3 holes, 2 holes, and then you pepper, and you have a salty moment in the morning. So that happens. Well, the message here is make users feel smart, right? It's not about design that matters to you. Well, it's fancy, it looks fantastic, but is it usable? Did I get it right? I don't have to figure out which holes is it. And most of the time I get it wrong, so. And this one, at least makes sense. And I just changed it at the last moment because there's a trend going on in this conference having puppies and cats picture. Unfortunately, I couldn't put that catches with my talk, so had to put up something up here, so I hope it makes sense. Right, so that brings up to convergence is equal to speedy learning, which means familiarity, right? So your users need to be familiar with the change that you're making, which helps them to have that learning very easy and smart. Know your user base, right? Another example, Amazon. How many of you have seen this logo, which was in early 1990? Perfect, there's 1, there's 2, and a couple of them. So Amazon actually started as a bookstore, early 1998, and that's how they were, right? And then they rephrased something with the O as something different, and then now we have this one, which is A to Z store, which has a beautiful meaning towards that logo. So that's the good example about how Amazon transferred from being knowing your users, from being only a book-only store, but then traversing up to all the products available, which is like A to Z. So, what is UI and UX? The most infamous question, and there's also a huge misconception about what's the UX and UI. So UX is all about people, happiness, understanding their needs, and making sure the products that you deliver are usable to them, right? And there's UI, which is more about navigations, menus, drop-downs, which mostly we fiddle with all the inspect elements, Selenium, and all that. How good is that? So a neat differentiation about what is UI, UX, and the usability aspect, where Heinz have a bottle of sauce, which most of us have done, flipping the bottle down and tapping at the bottom, trying to wait for the sauce to ketchup to come up. And then there's a new version of the bottle. But then, from a usability aspect, yeah, the design was good, but then from a usability point of view, you still have the sauce most of the time spill up when you open it up. So, yeah, good try, Heinz. So, slowly moving into the usability aspect, which I was talking about. Usability is all about testing your application, whether it's usable, right? There's a thin line difference. And also, I'm going to talk about a little bit about accessibility as well. I know Elizabeth and Heidi, thanks for coming, sitting up here, spoke about accessibility yesterday morning, emphasizing more about the design and which needs to be more accessible. So there's a little bit about that as well. So talking about usability, yeah, testing, making sure that it's usable for the users. And let's go ahead and look at some of the quality components of usability. So this is me putting up some of the points, sharing experiences that I've been part of a user testing group who did a massive UI transformation for an insurance company, where it's all critical. So learnability, where it starts, like how easy is it users to accomplish basic tasks on the first go, right? It's very, very important. It's not about making a shiny new UI. It's all about how easy it is to learn. And there's efficiency as well, of course. Once users have learned the design and how to navigate like point A to B, are they able to do that efficiently? And there's a number of tools out there which we'll discuss as well. And there's memorability aspect as well. So when users return, do they remember where they clicked on the last button, right? Which is falling down to the slide that I showed, where familiarity is equal to speedy learning, right? Where memorability is an important aspect, because all of a sudden, when you change something and then users feel stupid about it, it doesn't make a good change, right? And a famous example could be Instagram, where how many of you remember the horizontal scrolling aspect, which they suddenly put it up and then instead of a vertical scrolling? Yeah, I can see you're all like more than 10,000 followers on Instagram. Cool. So if you look keenly into it, that's exactly how Instagram did it, but then they reverted it back, right? So that's how you should make sure the users are not feel stupid about the change that you're going to make, right? And that's the memorability aspect to it. And errors. You don't want to land your plane on a bush up there. Instead, make sure your applications are error-free and how easily they can recover from those errors. Yeah? So those are the quality components, like to visualize it. So those were the pillars of usability, right? So now we know the pillars of it. Now, OK, fine. So what's next? So is there a testing methodologies that I follow? And how do I work with my team to make sure those components are achieved, right? So the learnability, the memorability, and all that. So there comes the usability testing methodologies, which is card sorting. So how many of you have done this before, card sorting? Oh, very few. Yep. So in an agile project, if you're starting, so that's the number of sticky notes out there. I don't know for what reasons it's there, but probably they're doing something sort of a card sorting mechanism. So this is one of the usability techniques, and this happens when, say, you're redesigning or designing a fresh new feature of your application, and you don't know what is the point A to point B where a user should traverse, right? So what happens is you label them in the cards out there, the sticky notes, and hand it over to your team members and ask them to sort it out and see what is the most common flow that they come out. And that is all about card sorting, because you might come up with like 3 people in the room having the same flow, which means that, okay, that is more usable than the one that who's always goes left instead of right? And there's something called wireframing, which is more about a 2-dimensional illustration of a page interface that specializes on the space, like, should I have a space here? What should I have? The login button up in there or bottom? So stuff like that. And you can actually see the diagram out there, which depicts, it's mostly 2-dimensional and having like boxes and how much space should I give there so the user can click on it. And how many of you have faced this instance where maybe during automation, you're on a website where you literally want to right-click, but then you don't want to end up clicking on a button or a link? How many of you? Quite a few. So that's exactly what techniques like that will allow you to solve the problems like card sorting and wireframing. And focus groups is wonderful that you can have where multiple people talking to each other and making sure you have a design that is more usable, where this could be a group of people in your company, but not part of your same team. Maybe they don't know what you're doing, and all of a sudden you invite them and then try to do something on it. And user testing, which is the more important aspect. So how many of you have been a part of user testing? Because it's a testing name that comes with, so we all get excited when there is something that associated with testing, like functional testing, automation testing. So how many of you have been part of a user testing? How many of you enjoyed that? Okay, I can see a few hands go down. So I would love to hear about that. But then, so what is user testing like? People get invited to the session, and you have like a test plan, and then ask them to do like, this is the new thing. You brief about your product, and then see how people interact with that application. And you being a silent moderator, take up a note. So that's how typically user testing happens. And mostly, I'm so glad to see the number of hands that's been raised, because mostly it's not the case. I'm really glad it has been, because mostly it's the developers, the UX architects, and the product owners who are part of the user testing group, right? And the problem about that is these guys are more optimistic, right? So if someone says, this is not something working, okay, let's go and change that. And everything happens. At the end of the day, coming back to the quality, often thought as an afterthought process. So we ended up testing each new versions every time. And that's what really happens. So testers, functional testers, actually needs to be part of that user testing, because the testers actually bring in the skepticism part of the feedback that's been given by them to balance it out, whether it's really a plus, whether it's really a minus or not, because that's exactly the balance that testers brings out. And of course, there's questionnaires and surveys. You would have heard about number of surveys that companies do. We mostly ignore them, I know, but it really helps if you really want to learn and make sure that the product that you're using every day should be better itself. Now, okay, we have seen the quality components, and we have seen some of the usability testing methodologies, and I'm fine. So what's next, right? So that's a big question. I've done all that card sorting, wireframing, user testing. So what do I get out of these? There needs to be something, right? So that's called a data, right? So you get 2 things. One is a quantitative data, and the other one is a qualitative data. So any guesses what these could be? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Perhaps the number of users and some kind of success rate, for example.
Absolutely. That's good, right? So quantitative, gather data that is measurable. For example, a percentage of visitor added items to your wish list, but then was not able to pull it off of your cart. And qualitative is all about, why did the user bounce out of your app? So explore the reasons and the motivation behind it. And there are a number of ways that you can get it. For example, A/B testing. I'm sure most of you have heard about it, where you have 2 versions of your application, and then making sure you having a version that is more accessible to users, right? More usable to users, and stuff like that. So that's the qualitative part of it. And there's a number of tools that you can use to get this data, which we'll see on the next set of slides. Tools and softwares, and there's a myth, right, even before going to tools. When people talk about user testing, it's all about, oh, do I need to have a user testing lab? Should I have a more professional one, like invite users and then pay them and stuff like that? Well, the thing is, you don't need that sort of an infrastructure to conduct that user testing. It could be remote, it could be structured, it could be unstructured, however you do. But end of the day, all you need is a data that you could go back and refer, which makes your product enhance. And the myth here is 5 users will find 85% of usability problems. So which means that you don't need a massive number of people sitting next to each other and working through your new features. So that's about it. And there's a number of tools out there, so not endorsing anything, but then my most favorite is Google Analytics, which gives mostly everything that we need, number of browsers, location, demographics, and all that stuff. And also Hotjar, where you can actually see heat maps where people actually click the most. So it gives you a playback mechanism of where the heat map of your, and then there's a user testing, and a few more. Now, the transition to UX and UI, right? So what happens from here? So there is a prototype already done, like, OK, we have done code sorting, we have done wireframing, we know this is the design that we're going to go through. So what's next? Of course, you need to have it painted on a UI, right? So that's the transition. So from a paper to a technology that you use. So no matter you use React.js or Angular or Vue, any front-end testing framework for that matter. So that transition is where most of the communication goes down, where instead of you building a car, you ended up building a bullock cart. So that's how it really goes. And some of the things that you can actually do is a CSS testing, where you end up building application for at least one resolution, but then you don't really test for other form factors and devices because you don't have access to it. And so how do I help here, right? So there's something called UI component testing. It's something that's getting a lot of popularity, where something is called Storybook. How many of you know Storybook? Wonderful. You're on the right path. So Storybook is nothing but a UI component library, which will help you test your UI components right from the beginning when you start to transition from your paper-based prototype into UI components. And that UI components can be tested. And again, that components that you have as a central part of a team will get consumed by a number of people a variety of time. And then how do you do that component testing? Well, you have the component, and then you have an option to do testing on it. And one of the things is the visual testing, where you can use a number of tools like ApplyTools, Backstop.js, a screener, and a number of tools like that, whatever works for you. And so that's the component up here. It's like a 3-minute video. Anyway, so if you go to Storybook on Google, I don't remember the URL. So there you will get all the information about what it does. So that's the usability aspect. Now, moving a little bit towards the accessible part, right? So there's a thin line between the usability and accessibility. So it's nothing but accessibility is a subset of usability, right? So usability is making sure the application and the products that you develop is usable. But then accessibility is all about making sure the applications that you have is accessible for a special group of people, right? There's the famous quote by the man himself, Tim Berners-Lee. How many of you know Tim Berners-Lee? Right, an English scientist who's known for inventing World Wide Web. So the power of web is in its universality. Access by everyone regardless of disability is an essential aspect, which makes it true, right? Because having applications accessible by everyone is not only nice to have, but a must to have. And the talk yesterday highlighted all the laws that every country has been following, that what happens if you don't abide by that law. It's not about you abiding a law, but more about making sure the applications that you develop is more accessible and pleasing to everyone. And disability is equal to a limited human interactions, and it's not about a physical condition, right? So if we don't give them ways, that's when it's called a limited human interaction. So when we try to include them in the ways that we do, that's all good. You're not doing anything special for them. It's all about you making sure they have access. And there's a number of facts to it in accessibility, like auditory impairments, cognitive, and a few more, which has POUR as a principle, making sure, like how we saw a few usability quality components, there are quality components, or an accessibility principles as well, which is called as POUR, which is perceivable, P for perceivable, O for operable, U for understandable, and R for robust. And that's how it goes. And also, it's not only about ARIA attributes. So there's also a huge misconception about UI developers. They're already swamped with a lot of story cards, and they're worried about their velocity points going deep, right? There's a new card showing up. I need to make sure this component or the feature that he's working on should be accessible. The moment you say that as a manager or a product owner, which makes him think only from an angle that, okay, this is going to eat up more of a time. I don't know what the heck that ARIA attribute does, right? And the thing is not only about ARIA attributes. It's all about, and people think this is more of a patches that you add to a punctured tire, right? It's not about that. But if you see an overall view of how the web accessibility looks like, where on the left, you have a HTML, and then there is a DOM tree, which we inspect and look for all the elements out there. And then there's also, which will be actually transformed into accessibility tree, right? And then you have a neatly painted visual UI, which we actually see. But then behind it, for every browsers and every things that you access, will have an accessibility tree. And that's when that accessibility tree it just looks like an HTML DOM, but then in a way that the assistive technologies understand. Like, so I'm talking about the screen reader, right? So many of you know screen reader as a tool that blind users will actually use and assist them to navigate and use your website, right? No, okay, cool. So maybe a task for you. So close your eyes, take an application that you're very familiar with, and try to use that. And then you know the pain that what they go through, right? And there is a number of aspects to it. So that's one. And the next thing is use keyboard only, not mouse. What happens then, right? And there's a number of personas to it, like permanent, temporary, and situational disability, where when I mean permanent, it's nothing, an impairment that's a permanent, like I'm completely blind or a color blind, and situational is more like I've gotten a surgery on my eye, and something that's sort of right. Or temporary could be something like I'm having a baby in my hand, or a beer in my hand, and I'm trying to fill with my application with one hand. So that's how stuff goes, right? But then the goal is to make sure the application is navigatable, and that's how. If you ask me, that's how the whole thing looks like, where how does the screen readers as an assistive technology interpret your applications and read it back to the users. And that accessibility is where the most of the attributes comes into picture, the ARIA attributes. And there's a number of standards to it. It's called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which is evolving, just like the W3 spec, 1.0, 2.0, and then 2.1. And you can achieve it through a number of ways. So one of the ways using Selenium is a little bit of piece of code up there. So I have like an hour-long talk about accessibility, but then this is more about a primer, which boils down to the same topic that we're talking about, UX and UI, where one of the things, as I mentioned, like don't use a mouse, but then try to use it, just navigate this application only by using your one hand with tabs and keys, and you can easily perform with Selenium as well. One of the examples is like this. And if you're using Puppeteer, you can also use tools like audit config, which will actually audit and say, like, this much is what I'm accessible. And there's also Cypress. They have direct libraries which you can help you test, where you can actually go down to test until each element or buttons on a page as well, instead of auditing. There's two aspects to it, right? So one, you audit the whole page, and then you have more time and energy where you tag for a particular element and buttons to it. And then for mobile, yes, we do have Espresso has from Google, where they have accessibility checks.enable, where you can easily add that to your existing test if you're using Espresso for your automated tests, which will help you audit and give you accessibility results for that. And there's also RoboElectric, which is just a matter of you using an annotation @accessibility checks. And there's accessibility scanner. This is very, very, very cool from Google, where if you're using an Android phone, and if you're using accessibility scanner, like anyone without knowing anything about accessibility can do an accessibility testing. And how? By using this app. It's called Accessibility Scanner. So once you install and open up an app that you're testing on your phone, there'll be a button which draws over your UI, and you just need to click it. But then it takes a screenshot and shows you exactly as in the screen that this portion of my app is not accessible, where from a text contrast perspective. And there's a lot more to it. And there's also GTX iLib, a library from Google, where you can actually use this to test accessibility if you're using iOS apps. Well, there are a number of tools available, but it all takes up to the time and energy and the passion towards you. Again, tying back to the keynote that Ashley gave, it's all about not really about death of liberal arts, but hoping the humanity is changing and people are trying to be more accessible and finding ways to develop applications. And also we, as a mass group of testers and automation testers out here, will also help make that change available for all the users that are accessible as well as usable. Yeah? And that's it. Thank you. I hope that gave a good background about usability and accessibility.